and welcome to the Art of Being Human. We're going through some segments here in terms of our learning about the development of the human being from birth until death, of things that we go through during our lifetimes. I know I talked about bullying last time, I've talked about adoption, I've talked about divorce, and today I want to talk about sexual abuse. This is important because it's rampant. I mean, I was so surprised when I found out that the people who are involved with the Olympics were abusing the students and the people who are younger that are the athletes, and I couldn't believe they would do such a thing. And I'm sure that the parents felt that their children would be perfectly safe with coaches and so forth, but you never can rely on anything, so you have to keep checking if your child is doing all right, if he's being molested, and you have to believe them if they tell you something is wrong. You know, one girl who was, I think, a gymnast called her mother every night and begged to be brought home. And the mother probably thought she was just having some teenage anxiety, and they didn't bring her home. So she was subjected to a coach who molested her all of those years. Well, finally it's having a kickback and it's coming into the open. And what it teaches us is that parents who love their children, who care for their children, have got to be very, very open and honest with them. They've got to check and make sure they're all right. You know, is anything happening? Is anyone touching you where they shouldn't? Do you feel uncomfortable about what's being done? And check into it. If a child complains about something, believe that there's something wrong. They may be exaggerating, but they also might be telling the truth. And you have to keep careful watch. You have to have an open communication with your child where you quiz them every so often, not to be nosy, but just to let them know that you care about them, and you have to develop a relationship with a child where they have the right to tell you and the freedom to tell you anything they want to tell you without you getting angry at them. I've told people that children that I've counseled, you can tell me anything you want to tell me and I'll never get angry. You know, I'm not their parent, but I wouldn't get angry if they was their parent, because there is a nugget of truth in what they say, and I need to find out what's going on. If it was my child and I thought they were being abused, I would be banging on somebody's door and some action would be taken. I would not allow my child to be abused, and no parent should allow their children to be abused. Well, let me start off with some statistics here. 1 out of every 4 girls is sexually abused before 18 years old. 1 out of every 4, that's quite a percentage, before 18 years old. 1 out of every 10 boys is abused before the age of 18. So there seems to be more girls who are suffering from abuse than boys, but it's wrong in any case. 75% of the crimes against children are sexual in nature. Now, it's a little bit different with abuses, for sexual abuses and for bulliers, because for sexual abuses, a lot of them are within the family. The victim knows who the perpetrator is because they're a family member. 90% of the abusers are known by their victims. That's a very high percentage. And the difference is with bullies, it's not necessarily a sexual thing, but with sexual predators, there's always damage to a child because of the fact that there's always some sexuality involved. Now, abuse causes children to feel helpless, fearful, angry, and guilty. How would they feel guilty? Every child, in any case, will feel that it's their fault. Why couldn't I stop him? I couldn't stop him. It's my fault he did this to me or she did this to me. It's my fault because I couldn't stop them. And what happens is they feel that they're to blame for what's going on, and the perpetrator wants them to feel that way. Well, if you didn't look at me in such a way, or you didn't do this, or you didn't have that characteristic, then I wouldn't be doing this for you. It's a little like the alcoholic, you know, blaming the family for his alcoholism when nobody else drinks but him. He needs to accept the responsibility that he's the drinker, but what he always does, he always blames somebody else. If you were a better wife, if you were a better soulmate, if you were a better child, I wouldn't drink. But it's your fault, you see, that I drink because you're not good enough. You're failing me in some kind of way. So if you transfer that to sexual abuse, it's a little bit like the same thing. If you weren't like this, or you didn't have that characteristic, or if you didn't, if you weren't so attractive, or whatever it is, it's your fault that I am sexually abusing you. But it gets to be very, very confusing to a person who's being abused sexually, because they also get an awful lot of attention from the person who's abusing them. They get taken places, they get given gifts, and the child, if they're young enough, they like all the added attention, and yet it doesn't feel right to them because there's a price to be paid for that. The perpetrator will give them the attention that they want and that they need and that they crave, because they may not be getting that attention at home. And they'll be doing all the things they want, but the price is the sexuality. They have to be able to be sexual with the perpetrator. And so therefore they get groomed. When a child is getting groomed to be sexually abused, what happens is that it may take a long period of time, but the abuser, the perpetrator, gradually gets to the child to take them into their confidence. They gradually get the child to like them. And they take them places and do things with them, and they gradually develop a trusting relationship so the child doesn't resist. And then when something happens, it's our little secret. It's between you and I. It's special. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you, but it's special, so therefore we keep it secret. We don't tell anybody. And then the child becomes afraid to tell anybody, because therefore they're hurting somebody that is paying a lot of attention to them. And how can they do that? How can I turn in a person who has been so caring and loving to me because they really do love me? And how can I say that that's wrong? And so you get mixed messages here. One, they love me. Two, they're doing something to me that's really wrong. How can you reconcile it? How can you love somebody but do something that's so terrible to them at the same time? It's an irreconcilable thing. You know, some children go through it at home with their parents. I love you, but I'm angry because you're not good enough. You do things that make me angry, and then when you do that, the idea is, I don't love you anymore, but yes, I do love you. So the child gets a mixed message. A mixed message cannot be reconciled. It just can't be. I can't love you and hate you. I either love you or I hate you. But when you have a parent or any other person, including an abuser, that's swinging back and forth between the two, I love you, I don't love you, I love you, I don't love you, the child cannot figure out which it is. The adult can't either. Adults don't do any better with mixed messages than children do, because it doesn't make any sense to them. You have to be in one stance or another stance. You can't be with and against at the same time, and yet that's the way it seems to be. And when you try to make sense of it, what the child is trying to do, the child is trying to decide, does he or she love me, or do they really don't love me, but say that they love me? And it gets to be such a mixed up mess in the child's mind, they can't conceive of it. They can't understand it. And adults can't understand it either. And then when you have a child whose brain is not mature enough to be able to figure it out anyway, because the brain doesn't even mature until about mid-20s, and yet they are focused on something that can't be reconciled with a brain that's not operating at full capacity because it hasn't grown enough and hasn't developed enough to do it. So it becomes a horrible thing, and it causes the children to feel guilty. It must be my fault. If I'm being abused, but so-and-so was good to me at other times, then I must be doing something wrong. It must be all my fault. Well, then why don't I talk to an adult about it? Why don't I talk to an adult about it? Well, because it must be my fault, and that means I'll get punished. Or maybe the person that loves me won't love me anymore, and I can't live without that love. Can you see, I'm kind of setting up a scenario for you here, but it happens all the time with children who are abused and children who are sexually abused, because they can't figure out, and an adult can't either, what the score really is. And it's unfair. It's just unfair. It does all kinds of damage to a child's mind. They feel bad because nothing seems right, but at the same time, it does seem right in some parts of it. So you can see the confusion that goes along with this kind of abuse. There are 8 ways that abusers use to get the victims to cooperate with them, and this is all a part of the grooming process. As I say, it may take months to get a child in a position where they're ready, as far as the abuser is concerned, to be abused. Now, these are the 8 ways. They ploy them with friendship. They might actually withhold their friendship if they seem angry at the child and the child is so concerned about losing their love that what they do is they're willing to do anything that they ask in order to keep the love that they have coming their way. So withholding can be a tool. The friendship I mentioned before, sometimes they'll bribe a child, buy them things. If you're good and you don't tell anybody, I will buy you this, I will buy you that. And they end up with all kinds of gifts, but what a price they have to pay for that. The price of their own integrity, the price of their own soul that has been damaged. Sometimes they play games with them that are on the sexual side, but the child isn't really quite old enough to understand that. These games involve touching and things like that. They play tricks on them. They use intimidation. They get a child afraid of them. They don't say anything, but they will be afraid. I know of a situation that happened in a city in this state. It was like a group home, and there were children in this group home. They'd lost their parents or whatever, and they had a pet bunny. And the home had it for the children. And they all loved that pet bunny, of course. And then when they started getting abused, the threat was, if you tell your adults or tell the staff members what's going on, then I'm going to kill your pet bunny. And they were so afraid of losing that pet bunny that nobody said a word, until finally somebody caught on. So they will use intimidation, they will use threats, sometimes they use force. You're going to do this anyway because I told you to, I'm the adult. So let me read through that once again. Friendship, withholding, bribes, games, tricks, intimidations, threats, and force. They tell their victims to keep the activity a secret, and it takes whatever time it takes for the grooming process to be completed so a child is ready in his mind to be abused. And sometimes the abuse comes with the first encounter, but sometimes it takes quite a while. Now, some children are abused just once. Others are abused over a period of time. I had a friend of mine, a Catholic friend of mine, and she was with her aunt, I guess. They had visited their aunt, her mother, her father, and she. And they were a Catholic family, and her aunt had a priest renting a room. And the priest tried to molest her. She told her parents, but the parents wouldn't believe her. The mother said, "He is a man of God. What man of God would ever hurt a child?" But then she told her aunt, and her aunt did believe her, so I'm thinking maybe something like that had happened previously. And her aunt reassured her and said, you won't be troubled by this again. And she did believe her. The priest left and never returned. She kicked him out, evidently. And so, therefore, you do have to assume that your child is telling the truth. They may be making it up, but also there's a good chance that they're not making it up. And if they're not making it up, I would rather take every accusation seriously and really check it out than miss something and have my child go through abuse. I would not want that. Now, there are several reasons why some people will become abusers. For one thing, they may be mentally ill. I myself do not think mental illness should be an excuse for anything. I know that mentally ill people sometimes commit crimes, and I know the usual thing is, well, I have a mental disturbance, I couldn't help myself, but most of the time that's just not true, because most mentally ill people would never hurt a fly. It's very rare that a mentally ill person ever hurts anybody. And so, I just don't accept that. If a person has done something, they need to own up to it. How much they take responsibility for it, I suppose, has to depend partly upon their mental health. But I think that a lot of people are using mental illness as an excuse for bad behavior, and that should never be allowed. But I have to say, since I'm a counselor, and I've been a counselor for years, that there is a certain amount of people that will abuse and will do things that are bad because they are mentally ill. But do not think that most mentally ill people commit crimes. They don't. Some people feel inferior, and they use the abuse to get a power and control over something. Now, I've said before in several segments, probably once in a while, I'll say abuse is a matter of power. People need to feel powerful over other people. For some reason, they have a need to do that. Healthy people don't have a need to do that. But people who are not healthy and feel vulnerable and feel weak, then they do have a need sometimes to go ahead and have power over other people. How can you do that? Intimidate them, make them feel that they have little worth, do something horrible like show them a gun or show them a knife and tell them what you're going to do if they don't do what you say, this kind of thing. So it's power that they're involved with, the acquisition of power. Now, some have emotional problems and can't handle the stress, and that may not verge on real mental illness as I think of it, real psychosis as I think of it, but they take their frustrations out on other people. I'm angry because somebody cut me off when I was driving, so therefore I'm going to kick the dog, or I'm going to do something like that, or I'm going to abuse somebody, because these stresses do build up over a period of time. And then when they build up over a period of time, somebody gets it. It's a case of somebody did something to me and I'm going to do it to you. And there is a sexual element to this. So abuse is against the law. And people do have the right to defend themselves. So how do you teach a child to keep themselves safe from abusers? For one thing, they have to be taught to stay away from strangers. Don't talk to them, don't go anywhere with them, don't take things from them, don't play with them, don't be alone with them. And you have to understand that a child's understanding is somewhat limited. This is a true case, a little girl who nothing ever happened to her that was bad, but she would go up to people in a restaurant and crawl in their lap and talk with them. She didn't think anything about it. She was little, maybe 2 or 3, and her mother told her, don't go to strangers. You cannot crawl up in the lap of a stranger. And she thought her child understood that. Well, they went to a restaurant, and here's this child crawling up in some man's lap talking to him. And she asked the child, you're not supposed to do that. I thought we had an understanding. You do not crawl up in the lap of a stranger. And she said, but Mommy, I asked him if he was a stranger, and he said no, so it must be okay. And this child definitely did not understand the scope of what the mother was telling her. This actually happened. Now, she was all right. Nobody did anything to her, but you've got to understand, you can talk to a child. They don't necessarily quite click in with what you're saying. You may have them repeat what you just said, but that still doesn't mean that they click in with everything that you're saying. So you need to be careful about that. You need to have your child avoid people that you question, that you don't think are particularly safe, that you don't have 100% confidence in. And you can't talk to them or be with them and keep your child away from them. You teach your child that they can say no. They have the right to say no. If a person comes to them and wants to do something with them or take them someplace, they have the right to say no. I can remember being taught these things as a child myself. And I was walking home from school one day. I was in elementary school, and a man came up to me and he said, "Hey, if you come with me, I'll take you on an airplane ride." Now, that didn't seem quite, I mean, we're walking on a street, there's no airport around, no airplane around, and it seemed odd to me, and I know I had been told, no, you can't do this, you can't go with people that you don't know, and this whole thing I learned. And when he offered to take me to get an airplane ride, I knew immediately that something was wrong. I didn't know what. And I said no, and then I started running, and I ran all the way home. I never stopped running until I got home. Well, my home was on the same street as that man came to me, and so I told my parents, and we stood there at the window, and when he walked by, we could see him walk by, and I could say, this was the person who told me he'd take me on an airplane ride. Well, that was the last time I walked home from school. My parents would not let me walk home from school. And it was a period of time where children were being abducted. And I know what the school system did. They took us, I was in the 3rd grade at the time. They took us row by row by row into a room and talked to us about not going to be with strangers and not accepting things that strangers had to offer us. So it was kind of a bad period of time when there were child abductions. So at any rate, I learned my lesson. I just followed what my parents taught me, and that was it. I didn't get into any trouble. So children do have to be aware that they can say no. And you can scream, you can yell, you can run away from somebody if they're trying to catch you. And in order to really help yourself with it, you have to accept your feelings. You always need to talk to somebody and tell them everything, because they need to know the whole thing if you're a child. And never blame yourself. It's not your fault if you're getting abused. You did not do anything wrong. There is an unequal power base between the abuser and the person who's being abused. So it's all about power. It's not about pleasure. It's about power. And so if a person is being abused, they have to be taught it's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't deserve it. And I say this hundreds of times when I'm dealing with children who have been sexually abused or even bullied. And then I said, tell somebody it's not your fault. No one's going to get angry. Don't blame yourself. The victim is never guilty. It's the perpetrator that's guilty. The perpetrator will always be guilty, but never the victim. And then you need to accept the fact that you're going to feel helpless, you're going to feel angry, you're going to feel guilty, and you're going to be fearful. And those feelings are natural when somebody has done something to you, and you need to help a child work through those feelings, mainly through reassurance that there's nothing wrong with them. The person who hurt them is the one that's to blame, not the person who went through it. So you need to validate your emotions and the child's emotions. Validate them. Don't shove them down. They're very important that you do not trivialize their emotions, but that you validate their emotions. And you may need to get therapy. If you have been abused in your past, it will still affect you for years. You may need to get therapy. You may need to take your child for therapy, and this can all be worked out. Now, I'm running out of time. But I just want to leave you with the last thing is to remember that you are not to blame. Don't push your feelings down and feel guilty. You need to acknowledge those feelings, get them up, work with them, and then realize that you are guiltless. There is nothing wrong with you. It's what's been done to you that's caused the problem. And get the therapy if you need it. then many people will need it. So I'm going to close it here. We're about out of time, and we'll be doing something else next week. So please join me then.